This is just a little overview of what we're going to be discussing in this session. I don't think I need to run through all of this, but just as a heads up, we're going to start with the resilience principles, and then we'll take a short break for questions before heading into the risk assessment. So this is our definition of resilience, and while this definition is comprehensive, we understand that resilience is complex and that it's challenging to translate definitions into on-the-ground projects and plans. The definition of resilience, along with many others, doesn't really give us a good way to gauge if a project or plan is more resilient. So this is why our office developed a set of resilience principles to help translate resilience to on-the-ground projects. So we have 7 resilience principles that can be used to guide planning and projects. It's important to note that because DOS works mainly with waterfront communities, the main hazards and climate threats that were considered in the development of the resilience principles relate to flooding and erosion risk. However, a community can consider these principles for other risks as well. These principles foster actions that are more equitable, adaptable, compatible with the natural environment and consider long-term impacts. They provide a more consistent approach to considering resilience in planning, but also allow communities to interpret the principles to meet their own unique needs. And again, these are based on a series of foundational concepts, one of which is resilience as a process and not an endpoint. So this is a graphic of what our principles look like on our 2-page fact sheet. I'm going to go into detail about each of these on the following slides. But just as an overview, all 7 principles don't need to apply, but the general idea is that the more principles that are applicable, the more resilient a project is. I also want to note that there's no specific prioritization of the principles, so there isn't one that's more important than another, but just to try to include as many as possible. So first is knowing your risk, avoiding risk, and reducing risk where unavoidable. This principle has multiple elements. First, it's about utilizing data, maps, and local knowledge to know where risks are historically, currently, or have the potential to be occurring in the future on the landscape. The graphic on the right shows our DOS coastal risk area zones, showing extreme, high, and moderate risk areas with mapped assets. Then we want to encourage consideration of avoiding risk through better land use decisions. For example, as seen in the graphic on the left, planning for future development in safer areas, which are less likely to be impacted by riverine flooding. Vulnerabilities and exposure should be reduced through the full range of measures, which include policy, natural approaches, and more. Next, we have maintain the capacity to adapt. This principle is about ensuring your project or plan is able to be adapted or modified in the future. A project or plan that is static and unable to change is not resilient to potential future conditions. A scenario planning exercise is a great community engagement method that allows stakeholders to better understand how a proposed project might perform depending on a future condition. In this example from Lake Ontario, the scenarios include extreme fluctuating water levels along with scenarios of high and low water levels. This exercise can help us see what types of modifications might be needed in the future. Or it could even show us what proposed project won't work under a certain scenario. Next is to seek solutions that provide multiple benefits and address multiple goals. This principle is definitely relevant across the board. Projects that provide more than one benefit tend to be more resilient and can give you more bang for your buck. An example would be green roofs, which can help with both flood mitigation as well as energy efficiency. Some of the co-benefits of green roofs are absorbing rainwater, decreasing amount of water that reached impervious surfaces, reducing building energy use, and reducing urban heat island effect. It's important to note the questions in the bottom corner here. It's something that we would ask ourselves when developing plans is, does my project or plan have more than one benefit intended to the benefactor? So next is let nature work and work with nature. Letting nature work and working with nature is a principle that also overlaps with other principles like being adaptable and applying multiple benefits. Left alone or supported through restoration actions, many natural features maintain or improve their risk reduction benefits over time. Next is stacking different kinds of resilience measures for more reliability should one measure fail. The goal of this principle is to help reduce the likelihood of impacts due to failure of a singular risk reduction measure. Risk reduction measures like levees, restoration approaches, and drainage improvements are not guaranteed. Along with stacking approaches, mix different approaches as well, as they all perform differently under different conditions and for different hazards. So this is a great graphic because it shows a single shoreline and all of the different options that could be incorporated to help protect the homes or other assets that are close to the shore. And again, not all of these would be necessary, but understanding that stacking these would be the most useful. Next is sharing costs and benefits equitably and do not defer risk to future generations. This principle highlights the importance of identifying solutions that do not exacerbate existing inequities or shift costs to future generations. Cost and benefits can be about monetary costs, but also about social and environmental costs and benefits. For example, when considering the impacts of green gentrification when identifying a potential new or nature-based feature. This image shows an example of unintended consequences of a hardened shoreline feature. The updrift side of this feature is accumulating sediment as intended, to grow the beach. However, the downdrift side, the right side of this photo, is being starved of sediment and the beach is shrinking. Another critical element of this principle has to do with considering future long-term impacts of decision-making now. While it can be challenging to think out 30 or 50 years, it's important to consider what those impacts might be. A scenario planning exercise, as mentioned earlier, could be developed to help think through these social and environmental impacts. The next principle is make decisions inclusive and transparent. This is a very important principle that can be applied to all decision-making on any level. Any planning process, including project development, should have a robust public engagement and outreach plan. This should be developed at the beginning of the process and clearly identify roles of all parties involved. As a decision maker, there needs to be a clear record of how decisions are made, and they need to be fully explained. Transparency, accountability, and inclusivity tend to lead to better decisions and make conflicts less likely. Develop an inclusive and equitable public outreach plan at the outset. These pictures are just examples of public outreach that has been done previously. So as I mentioned earlier, while these principles were developed through the specific lens of waterfront hazards, many are broadly applicable. Consideration of these principles, along with other locally relevant needs and opportunities for resilience, can help guide the better development of projects and more resilient projects.
Okay, it looks like we don't have any questions. I wanted to just mention that, and thank you, Liz, for going over the principles. I just wanted to mention that the risk assessment process is mentioned in our grant work plan. So for those of you that have a grant with us to do a local waterfront revitalization program, since 2019, I checked back on our previous year's work plans, each year that they were granted since 2019. Under Section 2, the task for Section 2 in the grant work plan, there's a statement similar to this. This section will also provide an assessment of the vulnerable resources and potential risks associated with storms, flooding, and the effects of climate change. And each year we add a little bit more to the grant work plans to incorporate the risk assessment process in an LWRP. We're the coastal program. We're the inland waterway program under the Waterfront Revitalization Act. So, we feel that this is really important to get integrated into our program in ways that are useful for you. So that's why we're doing this session today, to help you with the tools. We found that when we get the grant applications, some of them come in with information about the risk assessment and how they're going to do it. Some are pretty light on that. So that's why we're trying to provide you the tools for how to complete that task. And if you're applying for a new grant this year, you can mention these tools that you're learning about today if you're preparing a grant application. And we score them based on, there's bunch of different criteria for our grant applications, but one of which is, natural resources and how you're going to address protection of natural resources. So that's why we're doing this today. Also, as we go along with reviewing a draft LWRP, we as the LWRP planners, as well as our attorneys and our coastal consistency staff, are all looking for is there vulnerability? How is the community going to address that in the LWRP? So we'll be asking those questions as we review your LWRP. So that's why we're doing that today.
Yep. So I'm going to start the...
Okay, we're going to go ahead with some more of the presentation.
Wait for it to share. And then, yep. Okay. So thanks for letting me have a little voice rest there. So the next thing we're going to talk about is our risk tool and our risk assessment tool and our risk maps. So this is just how we define risk. Risk is the chance that an asset will be damaged or destroyed. And again, as risk goes down, resilience goes up. Our definition of resilience, which you've already seen, is the capacity for a community and its ecosystem to withstand extreme events and other forces or risks, quickly recover the interconnected social, economic, and ecological system structure and function in the aftermath of a disaster, and develop ongoing adaptability to rapidly changing environmental conditions and forces. So this is our equation for risk. Estimating risk is quantifying risk by scoring assets using these factors. Hazard is the likelihood and magnitude of a future storm event. Exposure is the modeling effect of topography and landscape features. And vulnerability is the level of impairment an asset would experience from a storm event. So this is an overview of our community inventory and risk assessment spreadsheet. The asset inventory and risk assessment, which I'll call our risk assessment process, should be completed by local government staff and with input from the community. In many cases, a consulting firm is very useful and helpful to a community in filling this out. Some of the information is more of the data-heavy elements in the process, and I'll call those out later in the presentation.
And Liz, these are available on our website, is that correct?
Yeah, I was planning to share links at the end.
Great.
Okay. So this is a very high-level overview of the steps in the risk assessment process. I'll be going over each of these in the following slides. I've also included a screenshot of our tool, shown at the bottom here, to give an idea of what it looks like. This is an example of the tool filled out with resulting risk and prioritization score. I know that's kind of small, but like I said, we can share the links so that you'd be able to look at this in the full Excel file. Okay, So identifying community assets of importance. Assets are the places or things where economic, environmental, and social functions of communities take place, or a critical infrastructure required to support those functions. Assets may also be part of the built or natural environment, as you can see here. So economic is businesses, health and social services, schools, housing, affordable housing included, infrastructure systems like transportation, and natural and cultural resources such as parks or beaches. The inventory categorizes assets into these 5 classes, which correspond with FEMA's Natural Disaster Recovery Framework. It is not expected that every single asset within a community would be included on this. We would want to start with the assets that are identified in the risk area maps and use assets with a known history of flooding and value in the community. We also want to consider grouping like assets. There are often existing data sets that can help identify assets, such as county or local hazard mitigation plans. The main information needed here is the asset name, address, latitude, longitude, location on the risk area map, asset class, and sub-asset or an asset subcategory. Except for the first 4 items here, the Excel is set up with drop-down options. For example, under risk area, you'll have options to select extreme, high, moderate, or not applicable. Rebecca will eventually be reviewing our risk area maps, but for now, that's all you need to know is that they categorize risk into 3 zones. Next is additional community asset information and a prioritization score. So questions we would be asking in this part of the risk assessment is, does the asset serve a socially vulnerable population? Is the asset a critical facility? What value does the community place on the asset? There's additional information in the asset inventory worksheet that supports a prioritization score. This is a new addition to the tool to help communities better prioritize when to implement risk reduction measures. And we'll talk about this more later on. So those top questions are the 3 main inputs related to this section of the assessment. There are various ways to identify social vulnerability, either through mapping data sources like the Social Vulnerability Index or the New York Disadvantaged Communities, which are located on our gateway, or through conversations with the community. Critical facility is the asset a FEMA-defined critical facility, locally significant or not a critical facility. And then last, again, is community value. What value does the community place on this asset? This can be determined through conversations with the community. Typically, value can relate to the importance of the asset to the community functioning or some other set of values like historic or cultural significance. And just to clarify, socially vulnerable populations are those with characteristics that can make it more challenging to cope and respond to hazardous events. Social vulnerability comes about through interaction of personal, environmental, and social factors. So next, we're going to look at exposure score and landscape attributes. Exposure score is a function of the asset's location as indicated on the risk area map, and the presence or absence and condition of a variety of local landscape attributes. The risk area maps essentially provide a base exposure score for each asset, and then the absence or presence and condition of landscape attributes that may contribute to increased or decreased storm damage. We've modified the landscape attributes for each of the coastal regions, which is why we have different regional versions of the tool. Shown here is an example from our Lake Ontario tool, just so you can get an idea of the types of attributes we are including. These are all yes or no questions, and there is an additional detail in the Directions tab, as well as the Exposure Score tab within the tool. This is probably the most technical piece of the tool, but local knowledge is very important here. Next is our hazard score. The hazard score is predetermined in the tool based on the 100-year storm event. This results in a hazard score of 3. Keep this in mind when running the risk assessment process. We want to use the 100-year scenario. If there is a desire to look at a more extreme event, there are instructions on how to use a 500-year scenario. More information about how this is done will be calculated in the tool. So next is our vulnerability score. The vulnerability of an asset and the vulnerability score is needed to provide insight into functioning of an asset given a 100-year storm event. It is able to easily withstand damages, or is it vulnerable and likely to have major impacts? This can be a subjective exercise, and it's important to get public input during this step. For example, if you have an asset, such as a library, do you know if it has flooded in the past 10 years after a 100-year storm event? Past history of flooding can help determine an asset's vulnerability. We've provided a vulnerability matrix to help determine a vulnerability score ranging from 1 to 5. Note that the matrix is set up to correspond with the asset classes, with an additional consideration for assets that serve socially vulnerable populations. There is a vulnerability score box on the Risk Assessment Tool tab that you will select 1 through 5 for each of the following, for each asset. Again, I know that this text is small, kind of hard to read, but we can send a link so that you can see it in more detail. So once the asset inventory and risk assessment portion of the process are filled out, the tool will automatically calculate a risk score. A risk score is meant to show the relative risk of an asset within the community across the assets identified to a 100-year storm event. We provided a risk score matrix that categorizes risk into different levels. This can help when we get into the last step of our assessment process. So here we're seeing risk score, prioritization score, and decision making. The prioritization score is a new addition to our tool. It allows us to consider the more qualitative inputs such as community value, social vulnerability, and criticality of an asset. The prioritization score automatically calculates within the tool with an output score between 3 and 15. That's shown at the top, across the top. The decision support matrix provides guidance on how to interpret both the prioritization score and the risk scores. Assets with severe or high risk scores and high prioritization scores are those assets that need risk reduction measures urgently. Conversely, risk reduction measures for assets with low risk scores and low prioritization scores may not be necessary or can wait. The 2 yellow squares in the matrix include suggested approaches for when the risk and prioritization scores do not match up. Assets with low risk but have a high prioritization score do not have an urgent need for risk reduction measures, but investment in these assets may be desirable to the community. Finally, assets that have a high risk score but low prioritization score can be slated for the next round of risk reduction measure implementation. Hopefully, at the end of the risk assessment process, the community will have a better understanding of what is at risk within their community and how to prioritize funding to support risk reduction measures. Ultimately, for developing an LWRP or a countywide resilience plan, for example, this process can and should help support the identification of needed projects. The last thing I wanted to note is one other element of the risk assessment project before I pass it over to Rebecca. The tool includes 2 additional tabs titled Test Scenarios. These tabs allow a user to run the risk assessment process again for an asset with an identified project. For example, if you have an identified project which includes elevating an asset, this would affect the exposure and vulnerability. You would rerun the tool with modified inputs to the exposure and vulnerability. This step, while not required, allows for an understanding of the anticipated reduction in risk due to an implemented project. All right, I'm going to pass to Rebecca.
Hi, so we now have Rebecca Newell and Peter Laridson from our GIS staff, and they're going to talk about maps to be used for the risk assessment process.
Hi, everybody. So much like the tool itself varying by region, we also have risk areas, which are one of the things that go into scoring within the risk assessment tool. And they are also done regionally based on landscape attributes and other types of hazards that vary locationally throughout the state. So that's just to kind of show you. So we have our Lake Ontario risk areas, Lake Erie risk area region, which is currently in an initial draft, but it is available should anybody need it prior to finalization. We have the downstate coastal risk areas, which were done first, and then our Hudson River. So there's a lot of different available data sets that pertain to risk and hazards, and they're going to vary based on not just availability, but also just potential within an area. We're not necessarily concerned about storm surge in riverine inland areas like we would be on the marine coast. So as far as available data sets, just bear in mind that they may all or just some of them be part of the inputs for a particular region when we're working with them. But basically, we look at the different landscapes and levels of exposure and susceptibility to risk. Rising sea levels, soil saturation, storm frequency and intensity are just some examples of hazards that face our communities. And so the inputs relate to the things you see on the slide. So when we're looking at risk areas, generally we like to look at floodplains, the low-lying areas next to rivers, streams, bodies of water, and we tend to look at those by the FEMA definition. So we look at the 100-year floodplain as the area that would be inundated by a 100-year flood, or better thought of as an area that has a 1% or greater chance of experiencing a flood in any given year. Storm surge is the change in the water level due to the presence of the storm. High tide flooding, which is also sometimes called nuisance flooding, it's that flooding that occurs in our coastal areas during exceptionally high tide events that aren't related to those larger coastal storms such as hurricanes. And again, that's an input that's largely just limited and used within our marine coast. And then dynamic natural shoreline features. As many people living along the coast know, the coastlines are among the most dynamic environments on Earth, and they're constantly being shaped by winds, waves, tides, and storms. And these ecosystems, such as salt marshes, act as important buffers between the land and the water due to their capacity to bind sediment, reduce wave impact, and even grow upward as the sea levels rise, protecting coastal lands and populations from inundation and storm impacts. When we leave them in a natural state, floodplain systems store and dissipate floods without adverse impact on humans, buildings, roads, and other types of infrastructure. But when these buildings, roads, and other structures are built where forests and salt marshes and meadows used to decrease the land's natural ability to store and absorb water, then we start to see some of the types of things that we want to plan for and help make our communities more resilient. So we try to have the risk areas account for this change by adding additional elevation on top of existing floodplain elevations to account for sea level rise, which is those pieces you see on the right-hand side of the slide. This is what our risk areas look like. The image to the right is a map of the risk area. You'll see the red is what we define as extreme risk. The orange is our high risk, and the yellow is our moderate or lesser risk area. And so what we did was we wanted to combine all of those risks together into a more simple, easily understood kind of methodology or nomenclature for folks for planning purposes. So all of those data sets that I discussed previously over 5 minutes ago that we've probably all forgotten about get parsed into likelihood of occurrence and then overlaid on top of each other in bins. So our extreme risk area are those areas where flooding is likely to occur within the next 20 to 50 years. The high risk area is where flooding occurs less frequently than the extreme, but has a 1% or greater annual chance of occurring, so that 100-year flood event. And the moderate risk area is those areas with a lower probability than that 100-year storm frequency that face a moderate risk of inundation from less frequent storm events. So we've kind of taken the technical piece out of it from those various data sets that we talked about previously and tried to make it a more simple, easily understood visualization for folks. And here's an example of an area in Sodus Bay in the Lake Ontario region. And one of the things I like about this slide is it has, within one small discrete geographic area, a good illustration of different types of floodplains and shorelines and how they translate into our risk areas. So even though this is an example within Lake Ontario, coastal risk area, it's a good example of potential risks to different types of shorelines and development. So on the left, you see a picture of some bluffs along the lakefront. They're highly erodible silts and fine sand that make up these bluff, and they're highly susceptible to erosion due to fluctuating water levels, wind, waves, seepage, and vegetation loss. So you'll see that little square that points from the picture, that lights up red as an extreme risk area. And kind of as you can see from the picture, and kind of imagine those trees topple down from erosion, water coming up and constantly shaping and moving the shoreline. On the upper right, we see that narrow barrier spit that is subject to breaching from high water and storm events. And that becomes increasingly complicated by the homes which are built on a very dynamic landscape. And then lastly, on the bottom, we see another type of sand spit located within the bay, which is a little bit more protected from the lakefront high water events, but still is a low-lying area that is susceptible to flooding during storm events and high water levels. And again, where we have some development that then poses risks to the community and additional vulnerabilities. Here's another example. You can see on the bottom left, that's the Hudson River. That's our mapped risk area just north, for those who are familiar, just north of the walkway over the Hudson. In fact, that picture on the right is taken looking down on the Hudson from that walkway. And then you can see same map on the upper left, but a little bit more zoomed in, showing you that aerial photography so that hopefully it helps kind of translate between what you're seeing in the image and what you're seeing in the aerial view. So here you can see we have a little bit of a steep slope leading down to a very low-lying area located along the tidally influenced Hudson River. And you have within a very small section of flat land, a railroad, a home, and other structures that are within our risk areas. So those were just some examples of how you might see the maps within your communities that you're working with. And here's just our last slide to wrap up. There are some links to our risk assessment tools, and the risk area maps are available for viewing and for download on our Geographic Information Gateway, which is our online mapping portal. And additionally, there's also a risk areas story map that describes a little bit more about what we talked about in this presentation about the risks facing communities and the creation of the risk assessment tool and the mapping. And if anybody ever has any questions, there's our email address. You can always reach out, and we're happy to help.
Okay. Did you want to talk about the matrix?
Do we have a link to the matrix? Can we share that, Rebecca?
Yeah, we have one other a resource that we were going to mention on the if you do you want to bring up our website?
Mm-hmm.
On the Department of State website under that first assess link, we've developed a matrix that compares our risk assessment tool to some other tools. And we encourage you to use our tool because we think it's comprehensive. And Peter's going to say a couple more words about that when it's under, I believe it's under assess.
Hi, folks. There are many resources on the web which try to educate folks about resiliency, flood risk, et cetera. And most of the tools are quick to do, easy to understand, and it's something that can be done in 15 or 20 minutes. I think that they would be beneficial during an initial discussion with the community at a planning meeting or something where you folks, consultants, are with the community to show some of these things, to show one of these tools. Most of the tools provide a report, a very simple, a very kind of I shouldn't say a simple report, but a detailed report about the general risk for that community and its resilience, population at distress, what kind of percentage of the area is in the floodplain, those sort of things. And I think it's a good primer for the folks to think about resilience and flooding, whereas the risk tool might not do that. And you'll see on the page here, you're just seeing the risk tool here. This is the matrix that you can download. And the first one is our risk tool, but then there's 4 other ones from the Hudson River Decision Support System. There's First Street Foundation. Actually, the White House has something, and then there's a national risk map, which is what FEMA puts out.
And Peter's done a nice, in this matrix, done a nice comparison of what each of these tools do, and you can delve into it at your leisure and see that some of them have more functionality than others.
Yeah, they really don't take a lot of time. It's not as if you're reading a research report or something. They're designed to have a quick introduction. They're designed so you can type in your address or put a community name in, and you can see it'll zoom into that area. It'll kind of show you what kind of resources are there, kind of flooding issues. One of them, Flood Factor, the First Street Foundation, is a not-for-profit, and it may or may not be free depending upon how someone sets it up with them. But it is free for a municipality. So if one of your members on your team is from the community, they can actually sign up and get a very detailed report for their community
For the whole community or on a parcel by parcel basis.
Yes, or on a parcel by parcel basis, yeah.
But then for purchase, it kind of lays it more out into being able to look at all the different areas and the whole shoreline as a whole. And it has been used for some of our countywide resiliency planning. So there is some people who have worked with it within our consultants that we work with on doing some municipal planning.
And so the ones that are not our tool are more high level than our tool. And so that's why we recommend the DOS tool for an LWRP. And, you know, again, if you're applying for a grant now, we just recommend you include enough funding to be able to do the analysis and the inventory, asset inventory that's needed for that tool. So don't be afraid to include enough funding to complete that tool. All righty. Well, I'm just going to turn this on for a second. So thank you, Rebecca and Peter. Oh, I can't know how
Well,
to get you guys over there.
No,
Please. Anyway, Liz and Rebecca and Peter, thank you for participating in our training today. So feel free to contact us, and our staff are willing. They tell me every week that they're willing to help consultants understand how to use the DOS risk assessment tool so that it will be a useful tool for you or local planners, you know, our regional planning agencies. Please reach out if you would like to. One other thing I wanted to mention is that in the new guidance that we sent a link to last week and is now posted on our website, there's probably, I don't know, about in section 2 and in section 4, there's a number of pages about risk assessment and what we're looking for in LWRPs, and also links to these different tools are mentioned in the guidance. So that's another resource that you can use to get information. Okay, so as a reminder, we do not have a session next week. We're skipping next week, and then we come back on the 16th. To do projects, everybody's favorite topic. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day today.
Thanks, everyone.
thank you.